That sulfur smell from a paper mill? It used to mean jobs, mortgage payments, a future. This place had it for over a century. Today, it's silent. Lunchboxes on shelves, calendars frozen in time, boots by lockers nobody's coming back for. The International Paper Mill in Mobile, Alabama. At its peak, it was why this city existed. How does something this massive just stop? The beginning. Let's go back to 1928. Calvin Coolidge is president. The economy's booming. And down in Mobile, Alabama, someone's looking at all those pine trees covering the Gulf Coast and thinking, you know what? We could do something with this. The International Paper Company wasn't new. They'd been around since 1898, started up in New York by a bunch of newspaper publishers who got tired of paying through the nose for newsprint. By the time they got to Mobile, they'd already built mills across the country. But this one was going to be different. Mobile had everything they needed: deep water port access for shipping, the Mobile River right there for transporting logs, rail lines already established, and trees. Thousands upon thousands of acres of southern pine, growing fast in that humid Gulf Coast climate. The kind of trees that regenerate quick enough to sustain industrial logging. The site selection process took nearly 2 years. International Paper sent scouts across the Gulf South, evaluating potential locations from Louisiana to Florida. They looked at timber density, water access, labor availability, transportation infrastructure. Mobile kept rising to the top of the list. The city was eager for industrial development. Local officials offered tax incentives, promised infrastructure improvements, basically rolled out the red carpet. The land where the mill would sit had been mostly agricultural before. Some cotton fields, some small farms, nothing substantial. International Paper bought up over 1,000 acres along the river for the mill site itself, plus tens of thousands of acres of timberland in the surrounding counties. They weren't just building a mill, they were building an empire. Construction started in late 1926. Hundreds of workers poured into Mobile. Construction crews, engineers, supervisors. The local hotels were packed. Boarding houses sprang up almost overnight to accommodate all the newcomers. The city's population swelled by thousands in just a few months. Building a paper mill isn't like building a regular factory. You're essentially constructing a small industrial city. You need buildings for the pulp mill, the paper machines, the chemical storage, the power generation, the maintenance shops, the offices. You need to install massive pieces of equipment that weigh hundreds of tons. You need rail spurs, loading docks, water intake, and outflow systems. The mill opened in 1928, and it was state-of-the-art for its time. We're talking about machinery that could turn whole trees into pulp, then pulp into paper, all in one continuous process. The initial investment was massive, something like $5 million, which in today's money would be close to $80 million. The opening ceremony was a big deal. Local politicians gave speeches about progress and prosperity. International Paper executives talked about their commitment to the community. Workers and their families toured the new facility. There was a sense of optimism, of possibility. This mill was going to put Mobile on the industrial map. And it worked. By the end of its first year, the mill was producing hundreds of tons of paper products daily. Craft paper mostly. That's the brown stuff, the sturdy paper used for bags, packaging, cardboard. Not glamorous, but essential. Every grocery store, every shipping company, every manufacturer needed it. The early workers came from all over. Some were locals, farmers looking for steadier work than agriculture provided. Some came from other international paper mills, experienced paper workers brought in to train the new hires. Some were just guys looking for work, willing to learn a trade. The pay was good for the time, better than most jobs in Mobile. 50 cents an hour for unskilled labour, up to $1.50 for skilled positions. You could support a family on that. The timing was good, for exactly 1 year. Then 1929 hit. The stock market crashed. The Great Depression rolled across America like a fog. But here's the thing about paper mills during the Depression. People stopped buying a lot of things, but they still needed to package the things they did buy. The mill slowed down, sure. Some workers got laid off, but it survived when a lot of other industries didn't. During the 1930s, while the rest of the country was struggling, International Paper started buying up more timberland around Mobile, thousands of acres. They were playing the long game. World War II changed everything again. Suddenly, the government needed paper. Lots of it. Maps, documents, packaging for military supplies, containers for shipping goods overseas. The mill went into overdrive. They hired hundreds of new workers, many of them women, since the men were off fighting. The machines ran constantly. The smell of sulfur dioxide from the pulping process became something people associated with patriotism, weirdly enough. The transformation happened almost overnight. In December 1941, after Pearl Harbor, the mill got its first government contracts. Within weeks, production had ramped up significantly. They added a third shift, running the mill 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. No days off, no downtime, except for essential maintenance. The workforce changed dramatically. Before the war, the mill employed maybe 800 workers, all men. By 1943, that number had swelled to over 1,500, and nearly 30% were women. This was revolutionary for the time, especially in the South. Women operating heavy machinery, working in the pulp mill, doing jobs that had been considered men's work just a few years earlier. These weren't office jobs or light assembly work. These women were running paper machines, monitoring digesters, handling chemicals, doing hard physical labour in brutal conditions. They wore the same protective equipment as the men, worked the same shifts, faced the same dangers, and they did it for about 2/3 the pay, which was the standard at the time. Nobody thought that was strange back then. The military contracts were specific and demanding. The paper had to meet exact specifications for weight, strength, moisture content. Government inspectors were constantly at the mill, checking production runs, rejecting batches that didn't meet standards. The pressure was intense. This wasn't just about making paper anymore. This was about the war effort. Materials produced at the Mobile mill were literally being shipped to soldiers overseas. One worker from that era, interviewed decades later, described what it was like working 12-hour shifts during the war years. He talked about the heat, the noise, how you couldn't hear yourself think near the pulp digesters, how the floor vibrated constantly from the machinery, how you'd go home, and your wife would make you leave your clothes on the porch because the smell was so intense. But nobody complained. You were doing your part. The mill became a target, at least theoretically. There were concerns about sabotage. Security got tightened significantly. Guards patrolled the perimeter. Workers needed badges to enter. There were drills for what to do if enemy aircraft appeared, which seems almost absurd now, but the fear was real. German U-boats were operating in the Gulf of Mexico. Mobile was a strategic port. The idea of the mill being attacked wasn't completely far-fetched. Accidents increased during the war years. Push the machinery harder, run it longer, hire less experienced workers, and safety suffers. There were burns, crushing injuries, chemical exposures. At least 3 workers died in industrial accidents between 1942 and 1945. The company would hold safety meetings, remind everyone to be careful, but the pressure to maintain production never let up. The rationing affected everyone. Mill workers made decent money, but there wasn't much to buy. Meat was rationed, sugar was rationed, gasoline was rationed. Some of the workers started victory gardens, growing vegetables to supplement their diets. The mill cafeteria served a lot of simple meals, stretching ingredients as far as they could. When the war ended in August 1945, there was celebration at the mill like everywhere else, but there was also uncertainty. What would happen to all these jobs now that the government contracts were ending? Would the mill scale back? Would the women workers get laid off to make room for returning soldiers? Some did get laid off. The workforce shrank back down to around 900 by 1946. Most of the women were let go, expected to return to domestic life now that the men were back. Some of them resented it. They'd proven they could do the work. They'd kept the mill running while the men were overseas. But that's just how it was. The returning veterans who came back to work at the mill found it changed. New equipment had been installed during the war years, new processes. They had to retrain, learn new skills. Some adjusted easily. Others struggled, especially the ones who'd seen combat and were dealing with what we'd now call PTSD, though they didn't have a name for it then. After the war, the mill just kept growing. The 1950s brought new machinery, new processes. They expanded into different types of paper products, added more buildings, more equipment. By 1960, the mobile mill was one of the largest employers in the city. Nearly 2,000 people worked there directly, and probably another 5,000 jobs in the area depended on it. The mill became part of the city's identity. High school kids would graduate in May and start at the mill in June. It wasn't even a question for a lot of families. That's just what you did. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, because before we get to what went wrong, we need to understand what it was actually like to work in this place when it was alive. Inside the machine. Walking into an operating paper mill isn't like walking into an office or even a regular factory. It's like stepping into the belly of some massive breathing creature that never sleeps. The noise hits you first. It's not just loud, it's a layered assault of sound. The constant rumble of the pulp digesters, the high-pitched whine of the paper machines running at speed, the rhythmic thumping of the hydraulic systems, the hiss of steam, the clank and bang of wood chips being fed into the chippers. After a while, workers would get partial hearing loss. That was just accepted as part of the job. Then there's the heat. Southern Alabama is already hot and humid, but inside the mill, the pulping process requires cooking wood chips at high temperatures with chemicals. The paper-making machines generate their own heat from friction and the drying process. In summer, temperatures inside could hit 120 degrees Fahrenheit easily. Workers would drink gallons of water per shift. And that smell, that distinctive paper mill smell that people talk about, it's hydrogen sulfide and other sulfur compounds released during the kraft pulping process. It smells like rotten eggs mixed with, it's hard to describe, cabbage, swamp gas. Once it gets in your clothes, your hair, your skin, it doesn't really come out. Mill workers' families just got used to it. But here's the thing that people who never worked in industry don't understand. There was a weird pride in it. You were doing something real, something physical, making actual products that people needed. There was a satisfaction in that. The mill operated on a continuous process. Trees came in one end, paper products went out the other. First, the logs would arrive, either by truck or floated down the river. They'd go to the debarking drums, these huge rotating cylinders that tumbled the logs against each other until the bark fell off. The bark would get diverted to burn as fuel for the boilers. Then the debarked logs went to the chippers, massive machines with spinning discs covered in blades that turned entire tree trunks into chips the size of your thumb. The noise from the chippers was incredible. Even with hearing protection, you could feel it in your chest. Those chips got fed into the digesters. These were huge pressure vessels, several stories tall, where the chips got cooked with chemicals to break down the lignin that holds wood fibres together. This is where that sulfur smell came from. The chips would cook for hours at high temperature and pressure until they broke down into pulp. The pulp would come out looking like brown oatmeal. It got washed, screened to remove any remaining chunks, then bleached if they were making white paper products. For craft paper, they skipped the bleaching and the pulp went straight to the paper machines. The paper machines were the real marvels. Some of them were hundreds of feet long. The pulp would get diluted with water and poured onto a moving wire screen. As it moved along, water would drain out and the fibres would start matting together. Then it would pass through a series of rollers, getting pressed and dried, until at the other end you had actual paper rolling out in continuous sheets, moving so fast it was just a blur. Workers had specific jobs at different points in this process. Digester operators monitored the cooking process, making sure temperatures and chemical levels were right. Machine tenders watched the paper machines, ready to make adjustments if the sheet started tearing or if the moisture content got off. Back tenders managed the wet end of the paper machine where the pulp first hit the screen. Broke beaters reprocessed paper that didn't meet quality standards. It was dangerous work. The machinery didn't have the safety features modern equipment has. Workers got caught in rollers. Burns from steam leaks were common. The chemicals used in pulping could cause severe injuries if handled wrong. Every mill worker knew someone who'd lost fingers, or worse. One incident in 1967 killed 3 workers when a digester exploded. The pressure buildup happened too fast for the safety valves to release it. The explosion tore through the pulp mill building, sent metal fragments hundreds of feet. The company investigation blamed operator error, but the workers knew the truth. The equipment was being pushed too hard, run too hot. Maintenance was being deferred to keep production up. The union fought back after that. The United Paperworkers International Union had represented workers at the mobile mill since the 1940s. After the 1967 explosion, they demanded better safety protocols, newer equipment, more training. They got some of it, not all, never all. Still, people kept working there. The pay was good, really good, especially for the area. By the 1970s, a skilled machine tender could make more than most professionals in mobile. The benefits were solid: pension, health insurance, life insurance, job security, or so it seemed. Families would have multiple generations working at the mill simultaneously. Grandfather on day shift, father on swing shift, son just hired on night shift. It created a culture, inside jokes that only made sense if you'd worked there, a shared understanding of what the work demanded. But that culture also meant everyone knew when things started changing. The golden years and the first cracks. The 1970s and early 1980s were probably the peak years for the mobile mill. Production was high, profits were strong, and International Paper was investing in upgrades. They installed new paper machines that were faster and more efficient. They updated environmental controls to reduce emissions after the Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act passed. They even built a new power plant to generate electricity for the mill operations. At its peak, the mobile mill was producing over 600,000 tonnes of paper products per year. That's enough to make about 24 billion grocery bags annually. Or to put it another way, enough paper to cover every inch of a football field stacked 40 feet high. Every year. The city of Mobile loved having the mill. The tax revenue alone helped fund schools, roads, public services. Local businesses thrived on mill workers' paychecks. Car dealerships, furniture stores, restaurants. They all knew when it was payday at the mill. But if you were paying attention, you could see the signs. The first one was automation. New machinery needed fewer workers to operate. A paper machine that needed 6 workers in 1960 might only need 3 by 1980. International Paper would say it was about efficiency, staying competitive. The workers would say it was about cutting labour costs. Then there was the shift in the paper industry itself. Computers were coming. More communication was happening electronically. The demand for certain types of paper was starting to flatten out, not collapse, just not growing the way it had been, and competition was increasing. Mills in the Pacific Northwest had advantages with different tree species. Southern mills in other states were newer, more efficient. International mills were popping up overseas where labour was cheaper and environmental regulations were looser. International paper started making decisions that worried the workers. They'd defer maintenance on equipment longer than they used to. They'd push production quotas higher. They'd resist union requests for wage increases, saying profit margins were getting tighter. In 1983, there was a strike. It lasted 6 weeks. The union wanted better wages and a guarantee that the company wouldn't close any production lines without negotiating first. The company said they couldn't make those promises in the current economic climate. The strike ended with a compromise that satisfied nobody. Workers got a modest raise but no job security guarantees. They went back to work, but trust had been damaged. Throughout the late 1980s and 1990s, the mill kept operating, but it was different. There was an undercurrent of uncertainty. Every time corporate executives visited from headquarters, workers wondered if this was the visit where they'd announce closures. Every quarterly earnings report that wasn't stellar made people nervous. The mill started running fewer shifts. They'd shut down one of the paper machines for maintenance, and it would stay down for months. Workers got laid off, but the company called them temporary layoffs. Some of those workers never got called back. By 2000, employment at the mill had dropped to around 1,200 workers. Still substantial, but down nearly 40% from the peak. The writing was on the wall, but people didn't want to read it. In 2005, International Paper made an announcement. They were selling off several of their mills to focus on what they called their core business. The mobile mill was one of them. It got sold to a company called Georgia Pacific. Workers hoped this might be good news. New ownership, new investment maybe. Georgia Pacific said they were committed to the mill's future. They weren't lying exactly, but their definition of future turned out to be a lot shorter than what the workers were thinking. The beginning of the end. Georgia Pacific ran the mill for 9 years. During that time, they continued the slow decline. More layoffs, more deferred maintenance, more talk about market conditions and competitive pressures. The 2008 financial crisis didn't help. The recession meant less construction, less shipping, less demand for packaging materials. The mill's production dropped. More workers got laid off. By 2012, employment was down to around 700. Then, in 2014, Georgia Pacific announced they were idling one of the 2 remaining paper machines indefinitely. Idling was the word they used, not closing. It meant shutting it down, but keeping it in a state where it could theoretically restart if conditions improved. Conditions didn't improve. In October 2014, Georgia Pacific dropped the real bomb. They were closing the entire mill, permanently. All remaining workers would be laid off over the next few months as they wound down operations. The city of Mobile was stunned. 700 jobs gone directly, probably another couple thousand indirectly. For workers who'd been there for decades, many of whom had never worked anywhere else, it was devastating. The company's explanation was familiar. Market conditions, competition, declining demand. They talked about how the industry had changed, how newer mills were more efficient, how they'd tried to make it work, but the numbers just didn't pencil out anymore. The union fought it, but there wasn't much they could do. The company had the right to close facilities. They'd followed the legal requirements for notice and severance. It was happening. The final day of operations was February 2015. Workers described it as surreal. Machines that had run continuously for decades were being shut down one by one. The noise that had been constant for almost 90 years was stopping. Workers who'd spent their entire careers there were walking out for the last time. Some of them cried, some got angry, cursing the company, the economy, globalization, whatever they could blame. Some just went quiet, taking one last look around before handing in their badges and hard hats. One worker who'd been there for 42 years talked about that last day. He described walking through the mill one final time, touching the machines he'd operated, remembering co-workers who'd been there, some who'd died on the job. He said it felt like a part of his identity was being shut down along with the equipment. The cleanup and decommissioning process took several months. Valuable equipment got sold off. Chemicals got disposed of properly, supposedly. The company had to follow environmental regulations about how to close down industrial facilities. By mid-2015, the mill was officially closed and inactive. Georgia Pacific maintained ownership of the property but had no plans for it. They didn't want to demolish it because that would cost money. They didn't want to sell it because who'd buy a defunct paper mill, so it just sat there. And that's when it started becoming what it is today. Decay and what remains. When a place like this gets abandoned, nature doesn't wait long to start taking it back. Neither do other things. First came the scrappers, metal thieves who sneak in at night looking for copper wire, brass fittings, aluminum, anything they can sell. They'll rip wiring out of walls, tear apart electrical panels, strip out plumbing. They don't care if they're destroying historical equipment or creating hazards. They're just after the metal. The mill's security tried to keep them out, but securing hundreds of acres and dozens of buildings is nearly impossible with a skeleton crew. Fences get cut, gates get forced open. People find ways in. Then came the vandals and the urban explorers, people who break in to tag walls with graffiti or to take photographs. The urban exploration community treats places like this as playgrounds. They document the decay, the abandoned machinery, the eerie atmosphere. Some of them are respectful, taking only pictures. Others spray paint everything, smash windows for fun, destroy what's left just because they can. The building itself started deteriorating fast. Roofs leak. When roofs leak in Alabama's climate, mold grows. Walls rot. Ceilings collapse. Water damage leads to structural damage. The paper machines that once ran flawlessly started rusting. The massive digesters, the pulp processors, the dryers, all slowly corroding. Inside, it's like a museum of industrial America, except the exhibits are decaying in real time. In the control rooms, old computers and control panels sit exactly where operators left them. Coffee cups still on desks. Calendars frozen in time showing February 2015. In the locker rooms, there are personal items still in lockers. Family photos taped to the inside of doors. Work boots lined up. Hard hats with names written on them in marker. These weren't supposed to be left behind. But when you've worked at a place for 20 or 30 years and then it's suddenly over, maybe you don't want to take those things home. The break rooms still have furniture. Tables where workers ate lunch for decades, vending machines that won't be restocked, bulletin boards with union notices still pinned up. In the maintenance shops, tools are still organised on pegboards. Spare parts sit on shelves, carefully labelled. Someone's toolbox sits open, wrenches laid out like they were in the middle of a repair job when time stopped. The massive paper machines are the most striking things. They're so enormous that walking alongside one is like walking next to a building lying on its side. Hundreds of feet long, multiple stories tall in places. The rollers, the screens, the dryers, all frozen in place. The pulp mill area is somehow more ominous. The digesters tower overhead, huge cylindrical vessels covered in insulation that's now falling apart. The chemical storage tanks, the mixing vessels, the piping that ran everywhere carrying pulp and chemicals. Warning signs about pressure and temperature are still posted. It's all inert now, but you can imagine what it was like when these machines were running hot and under pressure. Outside, the log yard is still visible, though nature's reclaiming it quickly. Vines are growing over everything. Trees are sprouting in places that used to be kept clear. The mobile river still flows past, indifferent to the fact that it's no longer being used to transport logs and pulp. The smell is different now. It's not that sulphur smell anymore. It's musty, mildew and rot and rust. The smell of decay instead of industry. But here's what's strange. Local people still talk about the mill like it's a living thing. They'll say the mill when giving directions, as a landmark. Older folks will still identify themselves as mill workers when asked what they do, even though they haven't worked there in a decade. The property sits in legal limbo. Georgia Pacific still owns it. They're responsible for maintaining it enough to prevent environmental hazards. But beyond that, they do minimum. The city of Mobile can't force them to demolish it or redevelop it without cause. There's contamination in the soil from decades of industrial operations. Any company buying the property would inherit liability for all that environmental remediation. So it sits, unwanted and slowly deteriorating. Every few years, someone proposes a redevelopment plan. Turn it into a mixed-use development with shops and apartments, or an industrial park, or just tear it down and make it green space. None of these plans ever get past the proposal stage. Meanwhile, the decay continues. More roofs cave in, more walls collapse, more machinery rusts into unrecognizable shapes. The human cost. Numbers don't tell the whole story. 700 jobs lost, several thousand indirect jobs affected, tax revenue to the city down by millions per year. These are statistics. But behind each statistic was a person, a family, a life that got disrupted or destroyed. Tom Henderson had worked at the mill for 38 years when it closed. He started there right out of high school in 1977, worked his way up from entry level to shift supervisor, made good money, put 2 kids through college, had a pension coming that would let him retire comfortably. When the mill closed, Tom was 56 years old, too young to retire, too old for most companies to want to hire him. His pension got reduced because he didn't make it to the full retirement age. He ended up working security at a shopping mall for a third of what he'd made at the mill. No benefits, no respect. He'd been responsible for overseeing a multi-million-dollar production line, and now he was checking receipts at the exit door. His wife had to go back to work. She'd been a stay-at-home mum for 20 years, raised their kids while Tom brought home a paycheck that supported the whole family comfortably. Now she was working retail at age 54, standing on her feet 8 hours a day, making minimum wage. The retirement they'd planned, the travel they'd talked about, all of that evaporated. Their house, the one they'd bought in 1985 when Tom got promoted to shift supervisor, the one they'd almost paid off, they had to sell it. Couldn't afford the property taxes and maintenance on their reduced income. They moved into a smaller rental. Downsizing, they called it, trying to make it sound like a choice. Stories like Tom's were common. Workers in their 50s and early 60s who'd spent their entire careers in the paper industry suddenly had to find new work in an economy that didn't value their skills. Machine operation experience doesn't translate well to much else. Marcus Williams was 43 when the mill closed. Third-generation mill worker. His grandfather had worked there in the 1950s, his father from 1968 until he retired in 2010. Marcus started in 1995, right after his stint in the military. He'd planned to work there until retirement, just like his dad. When the closure was announced, Marcus thought he'd be okay. He was young enough to find something else, right? But it turned out that 20 years at a paper mill didn't look impressive on a resume to most employers. They saw it as limited experience, too specialised. He applied to dozens of jobs, manufacturing positions at other companies, warehouse work, anything that might use his skills. He got a few interviews, but when they asked why he was looking for work, and he explained the mill closed, he could see them mentally checking out. Laid-off workers are risky hires in some managers' minds. If you got laid off, maybe there was a reason. Maybe you weren't a top performer. It's stupid logic, but it's how people think sometimes. Marcus ended up at a distribution centre, loading trucks. It paid $14 an hour versus the $32 he'd been making at the mill. His wife picked up extra shifts at the hospital where she worked as a nurse's aide. They made it work, barely. But the margin for error disappeared. When their son needed braces, they couldn't afford it. When their car needed major repairs, they had to finance it at a predatory interest rate because their credit had taken hits. The stress affected everything. Marcus started having trouble sleeping. He'd lie awake at night doing math in his head, trying to figure out how to make the money stretch. His wife would find him at 2 a.m, sitting at the kitchen table with bills spread out, calculator in hand, trying to find money that wasn't there. The younger workers had it slightly different, but not necessarily better. Sarah Chen was 31 when the mill closed. She'd been working in the quality control lab for 6 years. She had a degree in chemistry from a state school, which she'd gotten while working at the mill part-time. She thought she'd be marketable, and she was, sort of. But the jobs available in mobile for chemists were limited. She'd have to relocate to find something in her field, which meant uprooting her whole life. Her husband worked in mobile too. Her parents lived there. They had a house, friends, a community. She ended up taking a job in Houston. Her husband stayed in mobile for 6 months trying to sell their house, which had lost value in the post-closure market. They did the long-distance thing, seeing each other on weekends when they could afford for one of them to drive or fly. It nearly destroyed their marriage. The separation, the stress, the resentment about having to leave everything behind. They eventually sold the house at a loss, and her husband found work in Houston. But they never really recovered from those 6 months. The trust had been damaged somehow. They divorced 3 years later. Sarah would tell people it wasn't just because of the mill closure, but she'd also say it started there. The mill closure correlated with increases in divorces in mobile. Financial stress kills marriages. When a family goes from comfortable middle-class income to scrambling to make rent, tensions rise. People who'd been together for decades found themselves fighting about money for the first time in their relationship. Arguments about small purchases, about whose fault it was that they weren't prepared, about whether they should have seen it coming, saved more money, made different choices, even when both people knew logically that the closure wasn't their fault. Emotions don't follow logic when you're scared about making the mortgage payment. Mental health issues spiked too. Depression rates among former mill workers were significantly higher than the general population. Anxiety disorders. Substance problems increased. Beer and bourbon sales in the neighbourhoods where mill workers lived went up noticeably in the months after the closure. There were a few cases where former workers took their own lives in the years after the closure, though it's hard to draw direct lines. But people who knew them would talk about how they'd never recovered from losing their jobs, their identities, their purpose. These were men who'd defined themselves by their work, and when that got taken away, they didn't know who they were anymore. One man, a machine tender who'd worked at the mill for 29 years, passed away in 2017. His family described how he'd never been the same after the closure. He'd gotten a job at a lumberyard, but he'd come home talking about how it wasn't the same, how he missed the mill, how he felt useless. The official cause was listed as health-related, but his kids knew the mill closure had broken something in him that never healed. The community impact was broader than just the workers. Local businesses that depended on mill workers' spending closed down. The auto parts store that had been there for 40 years shut down within 18 months of the mill closing. The owner explained that mill workers had been his customer base. They bought parts to maintain their trucks, their boats, their tools. When their disposable income disappeared, so did his business. 2 restaurants closed. Both had been institutions, places where mill workers would stop for breakfast before their shift or grab dinner after. When the mill closed, their morning rush disappeared. Their dinner crowd thinned out. They tried to adjust, changed their menus, lowered prices, but you can't make up for losing half your customers. A clothing store that sold work clothes and boots, the kind mill workers needed, closed down. A grocery store in the neighbourhood closest to the mill shut its doors. The pharmacy next to it hung on for another year before giving up. The neighbourhood around the mill started declining. Property values dropped. People who could afford to move did. The ones who couldn't found themselves in a deteriorating area with fewer services and more abandoned properties. Schools felt it too. Mobile county schools had to make budget cuts as tax revenue declined. Teacher positions were eliminated. Programs got cut. The kids of mill workers who'd expected to have opportunities their parents paid for through property taxes suddenly found themselves in underfunded schools. Some families left Mobile entirely, seeking opportunities in other cities. The population of Mobile declined slightly in the years after the closure. It was a brain drain of sorts. Families with resources and options left. The ones who remained were often the ones with the fewest choices. The union hall that had represented mill workers for over 70 years closed in 2017. There just weren't enough members to justify keeping it open. The building where generations of workers had met, organised, fought for their rights, sat empty and was eventually sold to a developer who turned it into a storage facility. But here's the thing that doesn't make the economic reports. A lot of these workers really loved their jobs. Not in a romanticised way. They knew it was hard, dangerous, dirty work. But they took pride in being part of something bigger than themselves. They were making products that people needed. They were part of a team, a community. One former worker, interviewed several years after the closure, talked about missing the camaraderie more than the paycheck. He missed joking around with the guys on his shift. He missed the satisfaction of fixing a problem with a machine and getting production running smoothly again. He missed being part of something that mattered. That's what gets lost when places like this close. It's not just jobs, it's identity, purpose, community. You can't get unemployment benefits for those losses. What it says about America. The Mobile International Paper Mill isn't unique. Across America, there are thousands of abandoned industrial facilities. Steel mills in Pennsylvania, textile plants in the Carolinas, auto parts factories in Michigan, glass plants in West Virginia. They all tell similar stories. These places were built on a certain understanding of how the economy worked. You produce things, physical goods that people needed. Companies invested in communities for the long term because it made economic sense. Workers could build careers at one employer. The social contract was, you work hard, show up every day, and the company will take care of you. That contract got broken, or maybe it just expired. The economy shifted. Manufacturing moved overseas or got automated. Companies got bought and sold by investors who cared about quarterly returns more than communities. The logic of capitalism that built these mills is the same logic that closed them. You can argue about whose fault it is. Greedy corporations, outdated unions, government regulations or lack thereof, globalization, technology. Everyone's got their villain depending on their politics. But walking through an abandoned place like the Mobile Mill, politics kind of fall away. What you're left with is just the physical reality. This massive complex that employed thousands of people, that produced essential goods, that was part of the fabric of a city, is now just rotting. And it's not coming back. That's the part that's hard to accept. There's no world where someone reopens this mill. The equipment is too old, too degraded. The economics have changed too much. Even if somehow the demand for paper products skyrocketed tomorrow, companies would build new facilities with modern equipment, probably somewhere cheaper than Alabama. The Mobile Mill represents a certain era of American industrialism that's over, not just fading, but definitively finished. The post-World War II boom, when manufacturing drove middle-class prosperity, when a high school graduate could get a union job and build a comfortable life. That's historical now. What replaces it? That's the question nobody's figured out. Service economy jobs don't pay like manufacturing jobs did. The new tech economy employs far fewer people than old-school industry. The gig economy provides flexibility, but not security or benefits. For cities like Mobile, the challenge is reinvention. How do you replace the economic engine that drove your prosperity for nearly a century? Some former industrial cities have managed it. Pittsburgh transformed from steel to medicine and technology. But not every city has major universities and hospitals to build around. Not every city has the resources or luck to pull off that kind of transformation. Mobile's still trying to figure it out. They've got the port, which is still active and important. They've got some aerospace industry with companies like Airbus setting up plants in the area. They've got tourism. But none of it quite replaces what the mill was. And everywhere you look in Mobile, there are reminders. Not just the mill itself sitting there abandoned, but the people, the former workers who are now in their 60s and 70s, the middle-aged folks trying to build new careers, the families still dealing with the economic ripple effects. Time will eventually erase even these physical traces. The mill buildings will be demolished eventually, maybe in another decade or two. The land will get redeveloped into something else. The people who worked there will pass on. The memories will fade. But right now, in 2026, the Mobile International Paper Mill stands as a monument. Not intentionally. Nobody's preserving it or turning it into a museum. It's just a monument by default, by the fact that it's still there, deteriorating but visible, a reminder of what was and what was lost. The future of the site. What actually happens to places like this? There are a few possible futures. The most likely is continued deterioration until something forces action. A building collapses and creates a hazard. An environmental issue develops that requires cleanup. Liability concerns get too great for Georgia-Pacific to ignore. At that point, demolition becomes inevitable. Demolishing a facility this size costs tens of millions of dollars. Environmental remediation could cost even more. Someone has to pay for it. Usually it's the property owner, but if they declare bankruptcy or walk away, it could become the city or state's problem. There's a slim possibility of redevelopment. The waterfront location has value. The land, once cleared and remediated, could be attractive for other uses. But the upfront costs are enormous, and the return on investment is uncertain. Some communities have gotten creative with abandoned industrial sites, turning them into parks or mixed-use developments that incorporate the old industrial architecture. The High Line in New York, Gasworks Park in Seattle. But those are exceptions, and they required massive public investment and political will. Mobile hasn't shown much appetite for that kind of investment in the mill property. There are other priorities, other needs. It's easier to let it sit and hope someone else deals with it eventually. The most interesting possibility is the darkest one. Nothing. The mill just sits there, slowly decaying for decades, becoming increasingly dangerous and decrepit. It wouldn't be the first time. There are abandoned industrial facilities across the country that have been sitting empty for 30, 40, 50 years. In that scenario, the mobile mill becomes a permanent scar on the landscape. Future generations will drive past it and barely remember what it was. It'll just be the old abandoned buildings by the river. The Mobile International Paper Mill ran for 87 years. It employed tens of thousands of people over its lifetime. It produced millions of tons of paper products. It helped build a city and supported countless families. Now it sits empty, a physical manifestation of economic change and industrial decline. The machines that never stopped are permanently stopped. The workers who depended on it have moved on or tried to. What remains is steel and concrete, and rust, and memories, for the people who still carry them. You could see this story as tragic. The destruction of good jobs, the abandonment of communities, the breaking of promises. You wouldn't be wrong. You could see it as inevitable. The march of economic progress, creative destruction, the natural evolution of markets. You wouldn't be wrong about that either. Or maybe it's just what it is. A mill that ran for nearly a century, served its purpose, and then stopped when the economics stopped making sense. No villains, no heroes, just the way things work out sometimes. Walk through it now if you can get in safely, which you probably can't and shouldn't try. But imagine it. Imagine those massive machines running. Imagine the noise and heat and smell. Imagine the thousands of people who spent their working lives here, who knew every sound the machinery made, who could tell when something was wrong just by listening. They're not coming back. The mill's not coming back. That era's not coming back. What we're left with is this monument to American industry, unintentionally preserved through neglect and economics. How long it stands depends on factors nobody can predict. But for now, it's there. Rusty, dangerous, abandoned, but undeniably there. A reminder that nothing lasts forever, not even the things that seem too big to fail. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.